There is a moment in the life of an empath when something finally stops breaking. It is not resignation nor surrender. It is the quiet after a storm that has lasted years. This calm arrives after heartbreak, manipulation, emotional overwhelm, and the slow exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. And when it arrives, it feels foreign, almost suspicious, because the empath has never lived from stillness before. This new calm is not politeness. It is not softness. It is consciousness. It emerges the day the empath realizes they have survived every emotional collapse they once feared. Something inside steadies, and they no longer respond to the world with the same urgency or fragility. Jung would say that what is seen directly stops holding power, and this is exactly what the awakened empath begins to experience. Their vision sharpens, their boundaries shift, and the emotional noise of others stops entering so deeply. Before awakening, the empath was an emotional sponge. They absorbed tone, tension, mood, silence, disappointment, sometimes before it was even spoken. Their nervous system lived in hyper-attunement, shaped by childhood patterns of needing to detect danger before it arrived. But awakening interrupts this cycle. The empath begins to notice that not everything they feel belongs to them. They step out of the collective emotional fog and stand at its edge, watching instead of drowning. This is where the calm begins. It is the calm of someone who sees without absorbing, someone who feels without collapsing, someone who listens without becoming responsible for what they hear. The empath who once fused with every environment now stands in their own energy field, and the difference is unmistakable. It is like a lake that once mirrored every storm, now becoming perfectly still.
People around them sense this shift immediately. Some feel relieved. Others feel threatened. Because the empath who no longer reacts becomes difficult to read, difficult to manipulate, difficult to pull back into old emotional roles. Guilt loses its effect. Drama loses its spark. Even subtle emotional hooks, confusion, silence, passive aggression, stop having the same impact. The empath sees the pattern, the motive, the intention, and the spell breaks. This calm is not withdrawal. It is self-possession. It is the moment the empath recognizes that their emotions were never meant to be a public space for others to occupy. They no longer explain themselves excessively. They no longer apologize for their sensitivity. They no longer soften truths to avoid discomfort. The calm becomes a boundary without needing to be announced. For some, this transformation feels threatening, especially to those who relied on the empath's emotional openness to maintain control. Manipulators sense danger. Narcissists sense loss of supply. People who thrive in chaos feel exposed, because the awakened empath does not feed the emotional ecosystem that once empowered others. And yet, the real mystery is deeper. This calm is not merely emotional maturity, it is the beginning of Jung's individuation, the moment when the empath steps out of collective expectations and returns to their own center. But why does this calm feel so dangerous to those who depend on emotional chaos to feel powerful?
If the calm of an awakened empath seems mysterious, Jung would say it is anything but. This calm is the direct result of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. For most of their life, the empath has been ruled by an unconscious emotional reflex, the need to be needed, the fear of disappointing others, the instinct to soothe every discomfort around them. These impulses are not kindness, they are shadow. And only when the empath sees this shadow clearly does their entire emotional structure begin to transform. The wounded empath reacts automatically. They feel responsible for the feelings of others. They confuse empathy with rescue, intuition with obligation, sensitivity with guilt. But the awakened empath becomes someone who has turned their perception inward. They see the internal wounds that once governed their reactions, and once seen, they lose their power. Jung taught that seeing a complex dissolves its grip. This is exactly what happens when the empath finally recognizes the patterns behind their emotional giving. This is where the superior feeling function emerges. Contrary to popular belief, feeling in Jungian psychology is not emotional volatility, it is evaluation. It is the ability to discern the emotional truth of a situation with precision. When this function is unconscious, the empath becomes overwhelmed, flooded, easily influenced. When it matures, it becomes a compass that points directly toward authenticity. The empath can now sense intention beneath behavior, motive beneath words, sincerity beneath performance. This is why the awakened empath no longer gets pulled into emotional games. They do not need to wait for someone to reveal their intentions. They sense the intention immediately. They recognize when someone wants validation rather than connection, power rather than partnership, attention rather than intimacy. They feel the emotional architecture beneath interactions, and this clarity becomes its own source of calm.
Individuation frees the empath from emotional hunger. They no longer need approval to feel safe. They no longer fear conflict or rejection. They no longer need to over-explain to be understood. Their center becomes internal, not external. This is the moment when empathy stops functioning as survival and starts functioning as awareness. The shift is subtle but transformative. The awakened empath stops attracting chaotic relationships because they no longer resonate with chaos. They stop bonding through pain or caretaking because they no longer define themselves through sacrifice. Their feeling function becomes sharp, sober, and intentional. They give from fullness, not emptiness. But this clarity creates a new dynamic. People who once depended on the empath's emotional availability begin to feel unsettled. The empath no longer reacts on cue. They no longer soften the truth to maintain harmony. They no longer participate in emotional games they did not choose. The empath's calm becomes a barrier that others cannot penetrate with familiar tactics. And underlying it all is a single, unsettling truth. When manipulation no longer works, motives become painfully visible. So the real question becomes, what happens when someone sees so clearly that the entire emotional game collapses?
The calm of the awakened empath does not simply change relationships, it changes the emotional ecosystem around them. People who once fed on emotional reactions suddenly find themselves starving. Those who thrived on provoking, destabilizing, or confusing the empath now face a mirror that does not move. Jung would say that the empath has withdrawn their projections, and by doing so, they expose the projections of everyone else. And few things are more threatening to the unconscious than being seen clearly. Manipulators sense it instantly. Narcissists feel it as a loss of gravity. Drama-driven personalities experience it like suffocation. The empath who used to bend now stands still. The empath who used to apologize now observes. The empath who used to absorb everyone's pain now simply notices it without carrying it. Emotional hooks slip through them like arrows through smoke. The old mechanics no longer work. This is because the awakened empath has stopped cooperating with the unspoken scripts that once controlled them. They no longer react to guilt because they no longer fear abandonment. They no longer react to anger because they no longer internalize blame. They no longer react to coldness because they no longer need external warmth. Their emotional center has moved inward, and this shift collapses entire power structures. But the deeper thread is psychological, not interpersonal. The awakened empath's calm unmasks the shadow of others. When someone cannot provoke you, they are forced to confront why they needed your reaction in the first place. When someone cannot manipulate you, they are forced to face the emptiness behind their tactics. When someone cannot confuse you, they are forced to admit the intention behind their ambiguity. Your calm becomes their mirror, and not everyone is ready to see their reflection.
This is where Jung's theory of projection becomes crucial. People unconsciously project their unresolved wounds onto those who seem emotionally permeable. The empath was once the perfect screen for these projections, but when the empath awakens, the projection fails. The person projecting suddenly sees their own shadow reflected back at them, and this can trigger hostility, distance, or fear. The empath's calm becomes misinterpreted as arrogance, coldness, superiority, or detachment, but it is none of these things. It is simply clarity. The threat also extends to social environments. Group dynamics shift in the presence of an awakened empath. Gossip loses its charm. Passive aggression loses its aim. Power games lose their tension. People who depend on emotional chaos find the empath's calm unbearable. It dismantles the unspoken agreements that keep dysfunctional dynamics alive. The empath's neutrality disrupts the emotional currency that others rely on. What makes this calm so dangerous is not its silence, it is its accuracy. The empath can see when someone's kindness is strategic, when their vulnerability is performative, when their anger is unprocessed, when their affection is conditional. They see the architecture of emotional behavior, and once they see it, they cannot pretend otherwise. This clarity becomes a form of quiet power. But beneath all of this, one question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the empath refuses to participate in the emotional theater of the world altogether?
There is a level of awakening where the empath discovers something almost supernatural, the power of not playing the game. Not withdrawing, not avoiding, not suppressing, simply not engaging. Emotional non-participation is not indifference, it is mastery. It is the decision to remain centered even when someone tries to pull you off balance. And for Jung, this is the moment when the individual begins operating from the self, not from their wounds. The awakened empath senses the emotional architecture of every interaction. They know when someone wants control rather than connection. They feel when someone is seeking validation instead of authenticity. They recognize when someone's vulnerability is a tactic, when their charm is a strategy, when their anger is a mask. In the past, these dynamics would pull the empath into reaction, soothing, explaining, defending, proving. Now, they simply don't respond. This non-response is not cold, it is sovereign. It is the empath refusing to set themselves on fire to keep someone else warm, refusing to collapse because someone else cannot regulate their emotions. The empath no longer dances to the rhythms of chaos. They do not offer reassurance to someone who weaponizes insecurity. They do not offer clarity to someone who thrives in confusion. They do not offer empathy to someone who uses pain as leverage. They stand still, and their stillness becomes power. Jung taught that the self is the point of inner equilibrium, the center around which the entire psyche organizes. Emotional non-participation is the empath standing in that center. They are no longer pushed into roles, caretaker, healer, absorber, forgiver, by the emotional storms of others. They choose when to give. They choose when to speak. They choose when to step away. The compulsion has dissolved, and what remains is intention.
This creates a quiet but undeniable shift in power, because nothing destabilizes a manipulative dynamic faster than an empath who doesn't react. A guilt trip dies without guilt. A provocation dies without anger. Passive aggression dies without confusion. Triangulation dies without insecurity. The empath disarms the entire emotional battlefield simply by refusing to enter it. This is why people interpret the awakened empath as distant or hard to read. But they are not distant, they are discerning. They are not cold, they are conscious. They are not detached, they are anchored. The empath has learned the art of not caring what does not belong to them, and this lesson changes everything. The metaphors become clear. The battle that does not begin is already won. Nothing defeats the one who does not need to fight. The empath's strength is no longer in their emotional openness, but in their emotional sovereignty. This is the stage where calm becomes impact, not through force, but through absence. Yet this calm is not the final destination. There is a stage beyond non-participation, a stage where the empath's presence itself becomes transformative. And so the final question emerges. What is the destiny of this calm? What does the awakened empath become at the highest stage of their evolution?
At the final stage of awakening, the empath's calm evolves into something deeper than peace. It becomes presence, not the passive presence of someone who merely exists, but the active presence of someone who sees, understands, and remains untouched by the emotional storms around them. It is the presence of a person who has integrated their shadow, united their inner opposites, and anchored themselves in the self. Jung called this the fonction transcendente, the bridge where consciousness and the unconscious meet. For the empath, this is the moment where calm becomes revelation. This serenity is dangerous because it reveals truth effortlessly. The awakened empath does not expose others through confrontation. They expose them simply by existing. Their presence unmasks intentions. Their silence unmasks motives. Their clarity unmasks emotional architecture that people would prefer to keep hidden. In their presence, the masks people wear begin to slip, because deception cannot hold in a field of genuine awareness. The empath no longer needs to save anyone, nor defend themselves, nor prove anything. They no longer chase harmony or avoid tension. They simply stand in the truth of who they are, and this truth becomes its own form of influence. People feel understood in their presence, but they also feel seen. Not just the persona, not just the curated self, but the shadow, the real emotional engine underneath. And that kind of seeing can be both healing and terrifying. This is why the awakened empath becomes a paradox. They are gentle, but unmanipulable, compassionate, but uncompromising, warm, but unreactive. They move through the world like a quiet force, changing dynamics without trying, altering emotional patterns without speaking, redirecting energy simply by refusing to abandon themselves. They do not fight shadows, they illuminate them.
Jung believed that true wholeness is not perfection, but integration. The awakened empath embodies this fully. They no longer repress their own anger, deny their own needs, or sacrifice themselves for emotional peace. Their boundaries become internal truths rather than external rules. Their sensitivity becomes a tool rather than a burden. Their intuition becomes guidance rather than fear. They live from a state of coherence, and coherence is magnetic.
This serenity also becomes a form of psychological healing. In their presence, people begin to confront parts of themselves they have avoided. The empath is no longer trying to heal anyone, yet their groundedness creates space for others to face their own contradictions. Their calm becomes a tuning fork that brings emotional clarity to any room they enter. This is the wounded healer in its mature form, not someone who heals through suffering, but someone who heals through integration. But above all, this serenity marks the end of an old cycle. The empath has graduated from emotional survival to emotional sovereignty. They no longer live as a mirror for others. They live as the reflection of their own wholeness. Their calm is no longer silence. It is power. Their stillness is no longer fear. It is mastery. Their presence is no longer reactive. It is transformative. And this is the final truth. The palm of the awakened empath is not withdrawal. It is psychological power in its purest form. It is the serenity born from seeing clearly, feeling deeply, and remaining whole. And it is feared not because it is cold, but because it cannot be controlled.